Just want to end on that note, because it could only be a disappointment from here. Okay, so it's wonderful to see all of you here. Would the people in the back like to move to the front, or you feel happy there? I can still see if you leave, but okay. So as was described, I have several strands of research, so it may be odd to find me here talking to you who are experts in Middle East and North African studies, because I mostly work in ed policy. But a consistent strand of my work has been with refugees and immigrants, and it honestly is the passion that keeps me working as hard as I might work. So I was going to present a piece called The Other Iraqi Crisis. Don't sweat, I'm still going to present it. I'm just, you never know what happens, as my students here will tell you when I get on the mic. But I'm not sure the word crisis is the right word. It is clearly the one that's used in the media, and it's the one that we often throw around in education. We also have a crisis. It happens to be about 80 years long. But also, there's a crisis, two crises maybe in Iraq, if not more. But I think we could talk about whether it's a crisis or not. I come to you today with some work that's empirical work that's not been published, but I'm hoping, and I think it's possible, that we're going to have more of a conversation and a dialogue, although I'm the one that gets to be up here. So, and at any time, ask a question, interrupt, this is absolutely fine for me. Okay. Can I ask the audience, how many of you are students? I think a faculty? Oh, the hardest audience is the student. How about just allies and friends of mine? Perfect, okay, good. When do you think lately about the Iraqi crisis? What comes to mind? I will pick on your faculty, yes? What comes to mind? What's in the news? Sorry, that was bad.
The destructions of Iraq basically was a well-functioning country, and now it's completely destroyed.
Yeah. Lydia, you want to add? Yes.
Well, I think of the recent photos in the paper of the destruction of the art and the culture through the art.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Okay. So that's what I was thinking was the original crisis. So I was going to talk about the other crisis. So these are just, can you see okay? Oops. Can you see? Okay. So these are just a few of the bazillion headlines that pop up when you look at online media. But I'm not sure about the word crisis, and I'm not sure if you use it here in MENAS. Crisis to me seems like it's acute, time-limited, like an intense period of difficulty, but that it's bounded. And in some way, maybe it's a turning point or where a decision has to be made. And I just don't see that. I just see this as a very long, painful, more of an epidemic, perhaps, and a phenomena. So I'm going to try and not use crisis anymore, but since I had promised you this was my title, I'm going to try and stick with it. Okay. I want to talk about, with you, 3 dialogues of displacements. So the first one is clearly the displacement of Iraqis. Now this is both geographical displacement, but it is also displacement associated with losing one's place, one's social network, one's culture, one's country, one's language. The second, I think several of you are anthropologists. You are an anthropologist. Mahmoud, you are an anthropologist. Are there any other anthropologists? Okay, I'm not disappointed. I want to talk a little bit about the displacement of anthropological research. So many of you, even though you're not anthropologists and students, will do ethnography. One piece of ethnography has always been this participant observation, where you are there for a long, extended of time. This is a problem for those of us who study people transnationally on the move. And so I want to talk a bit about where I think we need to go and where maybe some of your dissertations can go in methods. And I'll talk about that. This is more of an epistemological displacement, right? And then the last is displacement of risk. So for a long time in social sciences, there has been risk theory, and then they have been pretty tightly coupled. And I want to talk about the notions of risk that came up in the study that I was doing, and how people used it variably to suit their own usual political or personal needs, and how they would displace the risk for one group, say ISIS, and put it onto the Iraqi refugees. You're a very quiet audience. Everything okay? I know most of you, and I know that that's not your usual way, so. Let's talk about the displacement of Iraqis. I think some of you are much more expert, probably, in Iraq and politics than I am. I want to just talk about the refugees. So, because of the Iraq War, 3.5 to 5 million, and again, this number is always very difficult to get if you look at different sources, have been displaced. That number includes those who are internally displaced and those externally. We know that most of those external displacements, right, are in Jordan and Syria. And we see this also on the news frequently. Since 9/11, from 9/11 to 2014, nearly 115,000 Iraqis have been admitted to the US under the normal refugee process. And I'm going to say normal, which isn't quite right, but the standard refugee process, all right? The year that I did this study, the years actually were unusual. So in 2011, there was a great dip in Iraqis being admitted to the US. Does anyone have an idea why that might be?
Combat operations in Iraq.
What's that?
Yeah, combat operations in Iraq with a lot of US forces.
That's one part of it? Anything else?
Paranoid they were going to let in terrorists.
There we go, yes. In Kentucky, there was a group of Iraqi refugees who were tried and convicted of terrorism. And they were living in Kentucky, and at that moment, all the procedures stopped about letting other refugees in. 2013 happened to be the highest number. And only explanation I have for that, unless someone else has another one, is it just that finally they had been processed, because it takes years and years to be processed. In the area in Western New York that I was collecting data, there were 400 Iraqi refugees were resettled at that time. Okay. I didn't put a lot of references in here. They have them at the bottom, so this might be alarming, especially to students who I always insist have references. I will give them to you if you email me. Let's say that. Just to put it in context, I don't know what you know about refugees. There's about 16.7 million refugees worldwide now. 5 million of those are Palestinians. Okay? And this number also can be plus or minus quite a large deviation. The group that I became interested in, and I'll tell you how that happened, I became very interested in Iraq refugees who had worked with the US military during the war. They're eligible to come, if they can document it, through special immigration visa, SIV, I will just call it. At the time, the program started in 2008 to 2011. It was supposed to end, and there was a maximum of 5,000 a year. Then they extended it to 2012, added another 2,000, and extended it finally to 2014. It has ended for a total of 29,500 possible visas. Out of those, only 12,233 have been awarded. It's an incredibly arduous process. So you can imagine that you have to have a lot of paperwork. All the application paperwork is in English, or in English. You must then sit for an interview of at least 5 hours. And during that interview, you must provide the names of the military officers who can attest that you worked for them as an interpreter, as a guide, as a translator, right? And this is very difficult to have all these things together, especially when your home is often no longer intact, right? So you've been fleeing. Okay, let me move on to what I think is related, this displacement of anthropological methods. So anthropology is in a bit of a conundrum because our claim to fame has always been this participant observation and displacing ourselves, going to some unknown place, spending a long time. And this has colonialist roots. So it was mostly, as we know, upper white middle class men who didn't actually have a career, but yet needed something to do. They were sent to these colonies to study these exotic others. And so this is how this began, although it has continued with much less discriminatory roots. So now we still have ethnographies of a certain place, right? So of a school in Syria, of a refugee camp in Kenya, in the US it tends to be, in education we do schools. So there are many school ethnographies. But it doesn't make sense to me anymore. It doesn't make sense. This is a global interconnected world that we're living in, and most of our interactions are not face-to-face. They're digital, they're online, they're through media. And the sites that we used to go to are not necessarily local. So now they may be supported by different political organizations, different countries, different joining of organizations, World Bank, UNESCO. And so it's very hard to actually do insight ethnography. How people have tried to attend to that is probably very familiar to you, right? So you can study through when you go to multiple places. You can try and study up, which is a call that has been to try and look at the powerful. And if we can get to the powerful, perhaps we will see. Also studying up the money, we're following the money. But all we're really doing is just shuffling around the place that participant observation has. We're not really changing it. Even in multiple site ethnography, which is something that anthropologists have been trying to do, is still, yes, it gets in the local and the glocal, and you can talk about glocalization, or if you're looking at money, you could talk about globalization. But you're still having actors, people in these very discrete sites. And we never find out what happens in between there. My answer to this, and it's not my answer, it's the one that I have stolen from Bruno Latour, is to try actor network perspectives. How many in here have heard about that? Okay. So it came out of science and technology, and it has a rooting in socio-materialistic thinking. I'll just be very brief. It's how to trace people, their ideas, their material objects, their discourses around wherever they go. Some of the criticisms are also some of the best parts of it. So they take people, actors, social actors, to be human and non-human. This usually takes people aback. How can an object be an actor? How can it have agency? How can it do something? In actor network theory, it can only do something if it has human investment. So I think the best example is your iPhone or your smartphone. It's a thing, right? But it's embedded with histories and economies and values and technology and entrepreneur and all of these things, right? And then when it buzzes or it rings, oh, I hope you're grabbing yours now, it gets us, there, say she grabbed hers, it gets us to do things, right? So it mediates our behavior. So that would be a good example. You don't start with the bounded place. You basically start following a person or a thing, and you trace it out. And the main unit of study is a translation. When two people or things come together, what happens? They work on each other, they try and change each other, and that would be the three main tenets of actor network perspectives. Okay. So I just want to tell you briefly about the study and then spend the rest of the time talking about risk related to the ethnographic data that came out. Are you okay? I see sleeping. All right. So it was a 26-month ethnography, and it was very broad aim. I was just trying to trace all the different services that refugees access, formal and informal, and if that made any difference on their educational choices, on their kids' educational choices, and on their vocational training. So in education, we're very famous for saying, yes, it's all the social things that impact. There's poverty, socioeconomic status, where you live, your race, your access to good food, dentistry, all these things impact education. And there have been some quantitative studies to show that. There's very few qualitative studies to show how that happens, and there are really none that show how that happens with refugees. So it was a very big, broad question. Do you want to know about the data? Students always want to know the data. Okay. So I had 112 interviews with adults, refugees, so they're semi-structured. 22 interviews with administrators, case managers, coordinators, people working in refugee resettlement agencies, of which there were 4 in this area. Interviews with 25 agency and organization heads that provided services to refugees. 12 business owners, because I was also looking at employment. So if you go through vocational training, do you get a job, and what kind of job is that? 15 community members, and then I dutifully did my participant observation twice weekly in vocational and ESL courses at resettlement agencies. Went to lots of meetings, governmental bodies, spent a lot of time on blogs. I did observations at 2 separate schools where most of the refugee kids went, and that generated the 317 pages of unwieldy field notes. I see Miriam smiling. 200 other documents just associated with refugees, and a bit more, but you get the idea. So it was kind of a big, unwieldy thing, but soon different themes emerged, which I'll tell you about, but the one that I want to share the data from today is about 27 Iraqi refugees who were actually in the area on SIV. So they had worked with the military and they had gotten them. As I began talking with them, I felt like I wasn't getting a very complete picture. Yeah?
SIV, how long of a visa is that for? Is it for?
So you can come, you can get your green card, and you can get citizenship. Mm-hmm. The process is just different in that because you worked with the U.S. military, you have a different front-end process. Yeah. So many of them were saying things that I didn't know. I needed to verify in some way, and it was very difficult to do that through documents. So I decided that I would try and interview Iraqi vets who had not necessarily worked with these individual refugees, but who had worked with Iraqis. So I ended up interviewing 24 Iraqi vets, which was not at all in my thinking or my comfort zone or something I thought I could do, but I felt like it was important to try and triangulate some data. Briefly, this is the other parts that I'm not going to talk about today, and I don't know if I can make this PowerPoint available or the reference list, but I'm happy to do that. Okay, so this notion of risk, it just really kept coming up, and refugees talked about how much they had risked and who had risked what and who was risking things for them. The vets also talked about what had been risked from the country, they had risked personally, what had been lost. And so there was just a lot of narratives about risk. And I had not up to that point used risk theory, but I felt like I needed to look at it. And I mostly used the work of Mary Douglas, although Anthony Giddens and Foucault also have written extensively about it. And it seemed to fit with actor network theory that I was already using, because there's this idea that there's an incompleteness, a contingency, and that things are emerging and very fluid. And in some way that this made sense to me. So that coupled with it coming up again and again. So I used NVivo to code, and you can do a word frequency in that. And do any of you use NVivo? In Nudist Vivo, it used to be called Nudist Vivo. Now that it's like 10.0, it's NVivo. And it's a program mostly for qualitative research where you put all your data in and you can code. Well, now they have these cute little things where you can do those word frequencies, so you get all those words, and the biggest words are the ones that are most frequent. Anyway, and risk came up in the top 10% of words that had been coded. So I realized I clearly needed to look at that if I was going to be true to the data, which was alarming to me. But anyway, I looked at the cultural enactment of risk and really looked at the notion and different discourses and how are they used variably to either support someone's stance, refute someone's stance, to explain what happened, even to explain the economic recession. They used these at-risk narratives. Much also was talked about who was to blame for the Iraq War, who is dangerous, who is a terrorist. So let's start with the first one is a fairly easy one, a little bit benign. So refugees are at risk, right? So there was a lot of talk even in the resettlement agencies they're at risk. They come from war-torn areas, they've been persecuted, they've lost family members. They are at risk for all kinds of post-traumatic stress, for other mental illnesses, for substance abuse. We resettle them into poverty. I don't know if you know that, but according to the Refugee Act of 1980, we resettle them, and as soon as they get enough English, they are to take a job. So the idea is that they, as quickly as possible, become economically self-sufficient. This means that most of them, most refugees in general, don't ever get put into high-level positions, and because their English is limited, except for the Iraqis, they don't have chance of mobility in these positions. So really, it's an awful position that we put them in, right? It's a bit no-win. Even to be eligible for the SIV status, you had to be at risk of threat or persecution. So. Then when you get to the US, then you have to account for xenophobia, racism, linguicism. This also puts you at a different kind of risk as a refugee. In contrast to that, refugees were seen and often talked about as great risk takers. Can you see this? I'll let you read them. So they themselves would talk about, as Mahmoud did here, about how the veterans would talk about how many risks these Iraqis took for them, right? The Iraqi refugees would also talk about this. The caseworkers, this was just like this common theme. This is actually, though, not new. So if you look at any ethnography about immigrants, people, and even in public media, I think the CEO of some big tech company, I don't remember, the CEO, I might have Google, was talking about how he loves to hire immigrants because they're such risk takers, and isn't this wonderful? And so this idea that they're great risk takers and makes them good workers. So this was talked about a lot. It was also used in some way as a pep talk often. So if you look at the bottom one, this was an orientation where refugees were coming, and they were essentially being told that they needed to take any job they could. It would probably be minimum wage. It would probably not be the job that they had thought they were going to come, since most of them were very educated or already spoke English. And so as a way to soften this, one of the instructors repeatedly said, you know, risking your life, you've risked your life, you got this new life now, getting a job, moving up is going to be nothing compared to all the risks you've taken. So to take this job, even if you don't like it, is not a risk. So in this way, this is would be translation in Actor Network. So he's trying to cajole them into doing this by preying on what we all know, someone telling you how great you are and that you have already overcome so much. Something, a risk very closely associated with this was the risk to the economy. So when I started doing this study, clearly we weren't out of the economic recession. And the area which is in Western New York, still I would say is just now coming out of this. And so there was a lot of tension and anxiety about the uncertainties of employment. This is an area that had lost a lot of industry jobs and factory jobs. And it was a time when, and I believe I talked about later, when youth were moving, so they would get their college degrees and they would move. So there was a lack of people to fill these jobs, but at the same time, there was a fear that the refugees were going to take their jobs. So these two are representative of things I heard from business owners and HR people. So they would never come right out and say, of course, I am racist. I am, you know, they wouldn't say this to me, of course, but they would say things like, well, we're not sure they're a good fit here. We're not sure they have the soft skills that US workers would have, and they would try and couch it like that. These two were a bit more straightforward. Okay to go? Okay. On the other hand, there were several community members and organizations that were trying to situate the refugees as the answer to this flight. So people are leaving, neighborhoods are becoming decrepit. We can put the refugees there because, well, it's very cheap to live there in these decrepit places, and they will renew this neighborhood, which they have for the most part, except now they're having to move out because all the prices are going up there. I wouldn't call it gentrification, but it's getting close. So they were resettled into a part of this area that used to be Italian and Polish immigrants. So it was very interesting to see this neighborhood change over time in history, but then to see the tensions between the new immigrants and the old immigrants. And one of the main problems was that the old immigrants, who had been there now for a couple of generations, thought that the new refugees from the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa were scary. And essentially that they're scary, they don't understand life here. And so this was kind of the counter narrative to that. No, they're gonna help us out. They're gonna bring new food to us, a new culture to us, and look at all their colorful dress. And in some way it was an exoticization of them too. By the time the study was over, just so you know, they were about 7 refugees in total, were 7% of this population. They happened to be 1/3 of the refugees in the state that were admitted in New York State that year ended up in this place. So you would think they would go to New York, but New York is too expensive to live, honestly. So, all right. Just to see if any of these risk narratives are founded, when you look at the data, and this is from 2012 report, so it goes back actually 2010 to 2011, that the overall US unemployment rate was 7.6, things have gone better, but the Iraqi employment was 22.6, which was actually a huge jump, a 40% jump. The average hourly wage was $9.79 per hour. So one of the things to think about in this is that the Iraqis who worked with the Americans and the UN and all the other soldiers were educated. Many of them were professionals. They spoke English for the most part, and this is not what they had anticipated. Okay, we'll talk about that a bit. So the fears about them becoming stuck on welfare in some way are borne out in this national research, but it's hard to tell because they don't parse out if they just got here, if they've been here a year, if they've been here 2 years, and we can imagine the experience of someone who just got here is quite different from someone who's been here for a while. The one related to the economy was that refugees were putting our national identity at risk. This is a very neoliberal, probably right-leaning concern of who are we if we have all these other people coming, who look just like terrorists, by the way, to live with us. And there was even op-eds in the local paper that were questioning, why this town? Why not not in my backyard? So why this town? Why here? First of all, it was a cold place. It's Western New York. They don't look like this. They don't dress like this. We don't really think there's anything for them to do here. They're straining all of our resources. They're straining our school teachers, and we already don't have a good school system. And so there was some anger towards them that didn't ever result while I was there in violence, but yet it was very public. Okay. The Iraqi vets were the one group, so all of them in the interviews, each one of them mentioned that these people should be here. And they would say, Iraqis should be here. They risk their lives, they should be here. If not in this city, they should be in the US. And so it's a contradiction because it's a very pro-military place, and yet you had this group of military soldiers, the Iraqi vets, and then there was Iraqi Vets for Peace, who had decided that the war was wrong. And they were very vocal about the refugees. Many of them volunteered at the refugee resettlement agencies. Okay, the refugees knew this. They knew, especially as things, and we'll get back to ISIS now, as the media started having more and more about ISIS and even Boko Haram allegiances to ISIS, and anything that was terrorist to them, they felt was a reflection of them. And they knew that that put them in a dangerous position, that they would have less opportunity, that there might even be violence against them. And at one point, some of the resettlement agencies, 2 of the 4, decided they were not going to admit any more Iraqis. That was in part because of the perception, but also there had been multiple instances of Iraqis being violent the refugees. And this is a domestic violence and violence with each other. Because, I mean, all of you study this, but just because you take people that didn't get along someplace and you put them in a new place, it doesn't mean that those old histories are gone, right? And yet now we're having them live together in the same neighborhood and lumping them all together and making them take ESL or whatever vocation together. So there was a lot of tensions and so much violence that they actually appointed one police officer just to work with refugees. So when I interviewed them and tried to talk to them about their anger, usually I didn't even have to ask, it would come out. 20 of the 27 of the refugees said they had been promised that they would get to go to college if they worked with the US military and then came to the US. So they felt like when they came and they were put in menial jobs or on welfare and not allowed to go to college, and yet the military were given a GI Bill. True, it's not as good as a GI Bill of times past, and that they were going to school, and here they wanted to go to school. It was very difficult for them, and they were very angry. That's why I felt I had to talk to the vets, because I just needed to see, is this what was being told to them? And indeed, all of the vets said, yes, that's what we were saying. Maybe not, yes, you will have a college education, but you have opportunity to go. And yes, we were told to make it sound like if they helped us, their life in the US and their family's life was going to be much better. So this was very odd to me. I can't find any evidence. I don't know if any of you are military. I could find no evidence in any documents that this is true. So it may have been just the conversations they were having. Yes?
Well, I'm an Iraq vet, and I dealt with interpreters.
Mm-hmm.
I'd probably echo some of the same sentiment these guys are saying, but that's something I never personally did or was exposed to, or never even heard that before. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that was a matter of things being lost in translation. Hey, this is the American dream. One of the dreams is going to college, but as far as I know, in my experience, there was no military policy to tell these people, to dupe these people into believing that they're going to college.
Yeah.
That's just my personal.
No, I agree with you. There is no policy.
Yeah.
There absolutely is no policy.
I don't know if that was something lost in translation, or maybe some people they talked to.
I also want to say all of the Iraqi vets that I interviewed served together. So it may have been an isolated, and I don't know who came up with the idea, and yes, in translation
Were
we
they
lost.
National Guard, you know, or
No, they
National
weren't.
Duty?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What I wanted to comment is there might be a policy, and usually there are policies,
Oh,
but not written
Public.
policies.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And everybody knows that these are to attract people to help them out, to collaborate on one thing or another, but nothing is written.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it
Yeah.
is common use for any colonizing government to do with intelligence.
Yeah, I will say I wasn't surprised. It didn't surprise me that they believed this and had conversations about it, and it didn't surprise me that I couldn't find the policy. I get, yeah.
Yeah, like I would be controversial. I doubt they have a policy in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So just the whole Iraq situation, there's no policy to justify what they did. From this principle, so I assume they don't have any policy
Yes.
to deal with the Iraqis at the same time.
And I think they also didn't anticipate the number of Iraqis that would come as well. Yeah, here and then here.
And just one thing I'm thinking back is a lot of the interpreters were dealt with through an independent contractor who would hire them
Yes.
and then give them to the military. So this could have been a policy of one of these independent contractors.
The recruitment bobble, yeah.
As far as U.S. military policy,
They talked about that too, that most of them, so a group of them had all been recruited together from this one area, and then they were assigned not to the group that was in, not to the military group in here, but they had all gone together. When I asked, well, did you talk to each other? How did that happen? And then they told me there was a man who came, then he took us all, then we filled out the papers, and then like 2 weeks later he picked us up. So, yeah.
Same company, independent
Yeah.
contractors.
Yeah, independent, yeah. Okay. Of course, the refugees and the people who work with refugees were just very alarmed by this displacement of this risk terrorist onto the refugees. And they would do things that were wonderful things in the community to try and get people to understand and to be exposed and to interact with them. So they had a photo exhibition through their eyes, which was the refugees taking photos and then what was in their eyes. They had cultural dinners or different ethnic dinners, and Iraq was featured one night. They had a cultural festival. So a lot of work was generated around this, and in the end there was some good relations. And there was one thing I can say is there was not one single either vet or refugee said a negative thing about the other. They didn't. It's not that they weren't always admiring, but they never said a bad thing. They had great respect and felt that they had done the work together, and they had nothing bad to say. And I thought that was unusual given the number that I had interviewed, actually. So I just want to make a really short conclusion here, because I think the conversation will be more interesting than anything I've likely said, is that the constructions fell kind of in three broad themes. And the first one was it was used to either provide a map for something or explain something that had already happened, right? So it's more sense making. People were trying to make sense of these things, as you saw in that. The second one was either to reinforce nationalistic ideas and identity and American pride, or to nudge that a little bit and open up these dialogues in the community about what is community, what is American, right? And then the last one, which was more towards the tail end, and I have been in email contact with some, is more just how they are grouped and then set apart from ISIS. And also how now with Syria in the news, they're often mistaken for Syrians. And for some that's okay, and for others, they do not want that designation at all. So again, I just want to say I haven't published this work because I'm not sure. You know, I don't know if you've had this feeling you're doing, I'm not sure that I've gotten it right. I'm not sure that I don't need to talk to more people, and I'm not sure what this might do for this population if I were to do it. At the same time, I think about it a lot, and now I've moved here so I also think about it a lot, because this is all Arizona. First of all, the border politics and the migration issues have a lot of the same xenophobia, linguicism here, but also the Air Force Base is very important in this community, as is Raytheon. And so I'm not sure. I don't want to leave you hanging. I'm just not sure where that's going. Before the closing, which I thought were more opening thoughts, I was very fortunate, and I thank you again for inviting me here. I think that those of us who work with mobile populations, refugees and immigrants in this country, have come from places that you are expert in, need to get together. And we need to figure out a way of sharing our expertise and perhaps coming up with more comprehensive, collaborative, larger projects capable of being in different places. I know that many of you do that work already. In education, we don't. And I'm hoping that this can be a beginning. So I don't know if that's in educational studies. I know a couple of you have come to see me. Miriam is one, because she wants to add an educational piece, or whether that's broader policy studies, migration studies, some co-teaching, some holding. Perhaps you had a lovely graduate student conference. Perhaps there's a way that we could do something together. And then to ask you what resources or information or references that I might share with you about refugees, either here in Tucson or refugee literature. So I've amassed a lot of this, and it does me no good if I don't share it. So I thought maybe we might start the conversation there, unless you have some other ideas. Yeah? Okay, thank you.